biology, if you will, for our listeners. I really see, right, nutrition as the physiological, the chemistry behind breaking down foods, how your body is taking that into your muscles and skeleton, right? And then Lea is our expert in the muscles and skeleton. And we're going to talk about all of that anatomy literally underneath you, ladies, and all the pieces of it that I had no idea. My hip pain and like my tight hips from being a volleyball player all attached down there, and like how my pelvic bowl really changes, especially as a yoga teacher, where I'm like, how's my mobility and what's that going on? So, we're in the kind of cool place for that. I'm going to let you take it away on what is, pelvic health in a kind of really baseline understanding, but then also what are some of those benefits of having somebody helping, you be better with your pelvic floor.
For sure. So I'll start by saying a little bit about what is pelvic health physiotherapy. And I like to call it pelvic health physio because it's not just your pelvic floor, and I'll talk about that, but it's very holistic. And there's a lot of nuances and things that play a role into the pelvic floor as a person, from what you eat, from what you sleep, from your GI system. And so that is all encapsulated in pelvic health physiotherapy. But when you think about the pelvic floor, which is that big thing where like, what is it? And it's one of those things that you don't really see. It's a lot of it is internal. So when you think anatomically, it's like you said, it's a bowl shape. And so at the front, you have that pubic bone, you have then your tailbone at the back, and your sit bones on the side, which are called your ischial tuberosities. And together there are muscles and ligaments and fascia that kind of wrap it up into this bowl. You have, depending on which anatomy book you're looking at, about 12 different muscles, and there's 3 different layers of your pelvic floor. The first one is externally, so that's kind of around the labial area where you have your mons pubis, your labia majora and minora. So there's a few muscles out there. And then, as I said, the majority of the other ones are on the inside. And those are muscles that connect to things like your hip muscles, like you said. So someone who has chronic low back pain or chronic hip pain, and they can't figure it out, a lot of times it's because the pelvic floor is a missing piece of the puzzle, and those muscles do connect directly onto that area. And so there's all those muscles in there. In addition to that area, you also have your pelvic organs. So as women, you have the bladder, then you have your uterus, and then you have your rectum at the back. And those are all in a very small proximity. When you think about your pelvis, it's the center and the core of your body. They all sit really close to each other. And so there's a lot of that crosstalk between the organs. And that's why it's so important that we kind of work on the function of all of those pieces. In addition to that, you have then your ligaments, your fascia, all those other things that kind of bring everything together in that bowl. And so pelvic floor is really that, but also so much more than that. So when I say that, I'm talking about, well, what is actually your nervous system? And you mentioned this biopsychosocial approach, which is really how I work with all of my clients. And the reason is, when we think about our nervous system, it is hardwired to our pelvic floor. Our pelvic floor is in charge of so many of these daily physiological functions, from our bladder and bowel control to our sexual function to supporting and structure of our body. And so if we ever feel in a state of vulnerability or of pain or fear or threat, well, what happens? We guard and we protect that area. And so that's where that psychological piece of the framework I use becomes so important. So that's just a snippet of how that works. The other parts are, like I said, thinking of your health in general, right? So our pillars of health, which is our diet, our food, our movement, our sleep, our mental health, all those pieces do play a role and have a connection with our pelvic floor. And so when working in that area, we look at all those pieces and how can we optimize all parts of your pelvic floor and pelvic health within the pillars, although you may not do it all at the same time because that can be overwhelming. And some people need certain things more than others. So that's kind of a very brief synopsis. The other part within it, as I mentioned, you have your organs, is also looking how we pee, poo, and sex. Like those are the bread and butter of what we do. So we talk about, optimizing our bladder habits, whether, we're leaking when we're exercising, or whether in fact you are always running to the washroom and you're peeing and it's only like 3 seconds. Well, that's not normal, and having that urgency, or whether you have constipation or you have, inability to have good bowel movements and that's painful or difficulty evacuating. And then to things around, sex and sexual function, as that is a very important thing for a day-to-day function. So whether that's you are unable to have sex or it's painful with certain positions, there's a wide range of different chronic pain, pelvic conditions that kind of fall within that realm as well. And then my favorite is just optimizing your health, where you feel like things are fine, but you learn so much. And that's what I really hope to say to our listeners. You're just this insight in this new part of our body that we've never maybe really recognized, but are things that we can make it even better. And prevention is so important too. So I have clients who are considering pregnancy and preconception and optimizing throughout that lifespan, because when we think about babies, that's usually when I see women come through, is at that point in time. And so there's a lot you can do before then, and it's never too early and it's never too late either. So I'll leave it there to get it started, and I'm interested to see what questions you have in relation to any of those pieces. I'm happy to dive into.
Yes, please do. And to give some context, I got married about a year ago. I personally feel like I want to know more about my pelvic floor and don't want to step into some of those things you hear about not being prepared when it comes to labor, being scared of labor. Like, I think it's such a beautiful process as is. And there's things that we can do, to start even 2 years ahead of time, which is what we see in like the nutrition cleanup side of things. And so I want to get this information out there. Lea, talk to me a little bit about where that line is when people can be curious and then they are, maybe in too much pain and there's shame involved about like reaching out to you, like, do doctors refer you to pelvic floor therapy? Like, how does somebody even like begin to be curious about using this resource?
I think it's different for every person in their own journey, and it depends on where they are and where they're working through. I think if it's someone who is more so curious and just interested in understanding their body, coming across social media accounts, for instance, there's always so much knowledge and information out there just to get that started. And I always say, having that conversation with pelvic health physio, you might go in with one question and you leave with so many answers you didn't know you had questions about, right? And it's a really safe space to ask some of those weird questions where you're like, is this TMI? And there's no such thing. Like, we ask and answer all those things. And so from that end of the spectrum, absolutely, just kind of having kind of those more beginning conversations, making sure my bladder and bowel are kind of in good health and things are working well. And, when I'm exercising or just seeing my pelvic floor, is it working well? Or is there something off? Now, if you're someone where you're like, like, interestingly, now that you're saying this, like, I've noticed that, always had a bit of back pain, or my hips always hurt, or, if I'm lifting heavy, I have a bit of incontinence, or, if I'm having sex in that position on my stomach or on my hands and knees or whatever it is that hurts. Those are all signs that you actually do need to see a pelvic health physio and work on that area, because it's your body telling you that there's something there. And yes, those are things that are very common in society and they try to normalize it, but the reality is that's not normal. And there are so many things you can do within your control to make it better and not have to deal with that from a day-to-day basis. So that's my job, and as pelvic physio, our job, to make sure we can empower you in that journey for yourself. So if you are someone with kind of some of those pieces, absolutely, whether that's, and it also depends on what country you're in. So I don't know in the States necessarily how it works here. You don't need a referral from your doctor to see a pelvic health physiotherapist. We are directly able to work with clients, although sometimes with insurance companies, they do require that. But absolutely, you can just kind of find who you'd like to see and then book directly. Sometimes we have relationships with our gynecologists if they're planning to have surgery or have had surgery with conditions such as endometriosis or bladder pain syndrome, then those do tend to get referred within pelvic health physiotherapy. So it can kind of go either way. And really, there's a lot of options in kind of how to work with it. There is in person and there's also virtual. I would say if you are working through some of these pieces that are painful or these kind of symptoms, then it would be really helpful to have that in-person piece, because what we do is a very thorough assessment in the sense of a hands-on internal assessment. So here in Canada, we are rostered within the Canadian Physiotherapy, or within our province. Ours is the CPO, the College of Physiotherapists of Ontario. And so that means we have special training to do what are called internal examinations. And I know in the States, they do the same thing there. They probably just have little different logistics, how to go about it. Yeah. And essentially part of what we do is a vaginal internal assessment with our finger. And we are able to actually then feel what is happening inside of your pelvic floor. And that gives us a lot of great information and gives you a lot of information that you may have not noticed. So it's like going to any physical therapist where, they're assessing your muscle strength. What we do is we see kind of, how are the muscles? Are they strong enough? Are they weak? Are they tense? Are they not able to fully relax and they don't have that flexibility? Where are your organs positioned, and are they relatively in a good position, or have they descended over time? And 1 in 2 women after the age of 50 have a pelvic organ prolapse, which is that descent of your pelvic floor. So we look at all those different pieces. And so for a lot, those are important to have kind of those in-person assessments. And if it's someone who's more curious, maybe just having that kind of virtual touch base to kind of go through it and see like, okay, this is great. Here are some pieces to work on, because a lot of it is coaching and kind of guiding you in what you need to do. And there's a lot that can be done just from kind of giving some pieces of advice, which I hope today we can talk about for things like, how to optimize your bladder, and what are bladder habits that are good, and what are things that we want to avoid. And a lot of it you can start to do on your own. It's a lot of behavioral training, actually.
Yes, it is behavioral. I was going to double down on that, because when I've laid on the table, and thankfully I had a very compassionate person who walked me through it. It is one of the most vulnerable things I've done, right? But thinking about if I'm preparing for labor someday, I'm willing to get comfortable on the table, with practitioners, and really checking in to see how I'm feeling, and learning how to bulge, learning how to really relax your entire pelvic floor down there, or the times where some people hold stress in their shoulders. It's a very easy and not thing to witness, oh, interesting, they're tense. But ladies, we do that underneath us. And I didn't realize how much I was doing it until I left my 3rd session and was I'm still doing it. It's a habit, just like anything else. And we're going to talk about right now with bladder, I'll let you kind of elaborate. Maybe we haven't activated some of those muscles, and we don't have, an athletic background, or, are constantly flexing, and then descent begins to happen. And the incontinence piece of it. So let's talk bladder, and then we'll talk my favorite, pooping, and just how those pieces of the puzzle work, because I put people on Fiverr and they're like, whoa, and we don't think about your low colon, and there's so much of that happens. But I think the incontinence piece is important, because I've heard, some people are like, oh yeah, it's just kind of part of my genetics, and I'm like, I mean, it's still a body part, we can work on it.
Yes. Before we go there, just because of what you said, it's so funny. And I'll talk all things pee and poop for sure in a second. But you were talking about this tension, and you found that you were holding this tension in your pelvic floor. And this is so huge. And maybe we can spend some time talking about it afterwards. But there's a few parts of our body where we do that, whether it's your jaw, your upper kind of trap, kind of shoulder area, or your pelvic floor. Those are kind of the 3 areas. And what that is your nervous system protecting you, right? That you said, that sense of vulnerability. So whether there is some trauma in the past that, you have this kind of association where it's what I say is hugging and loving yourself a little too tight. And it comes from a good place, but it's just a bit too much. And they had this study that they did where they actually put parts around the kind of the pelvic floor to look at the electrical muscle stimulation. And they got these women to watch scary movies, and they put it on other parts of the body. And the very first part of their body to flicker and contract is the pelvic floor. So we know that our nervous system is hardwired, again, from a very protective, vulnerable state. And it makes sense why you would do that. But sometimes over time in society and our just life and kind of go, we're in this sympathetic drive. We then have now assumed everything is, threatening, and we're stuck in this tension. And so it's bringing that awareness and learning how to relax. And I would say my caseload is 50-50. Half of my women have a pelvic floor where they're actually too protective and don't have the strength or the ability to relax. And then about half are just truly having that weakness and needing to build it. And some shift from one to the other too. So that's an important piece I just wanted to highlight, because it is a cross practice all the time. And I love that you have that personal experience, because I actually had a similar experience in how I went into it. And I think especially for those who maybe have never had babies, they're kind of like, oh, this is not for me, it's a baby thing, but absolutely not. And this is usually the population that I work with in this area. Okay, but shifting gears into bladder habits. Okay, so peeing. So I'm going to tell you what normal bladder habits should be, and this is usually eye-opening in itself. So in a given day, for a healthy bladder, you should be going 5 to 7 times a day, and each time you're going should be about 8 to 10 Mississippi seconds long. Okay. Usually your morning pee is the longest, and it should be that kind of range in time. You should never at any point be pushing your pee out. And the reason is the way our bladder physiology works is you have your pelvic floor, which is at the bottom, and then you have your bladder muscle, which is your detrusor. When you are peeing, your detrusor muscle is actually contracted and your pelvic floor muscle is relaxed. So it's really important to relax and let things go when you're peeing. If you're ever peeing and you're trying to push your pee out, or you're hovering on a toilet and you're not sitting, you're squatting, well, what's happening is you're actually contracting the pelvic floor muscles. And so then you have this co-contraction where it's getting all confused and mixed up and it doesn't know what to do. And you're not fully emptying your bladder. And that's really not a good thing. So you want to let it flow. You want to let it go, do its thing, and make sure you're in a comfortable position. So that talks about toilet posture. So when some of you may have heard of a squatty potty, and that's also really good for the poops, which we'll talk about in a second, but making sure that your feet are actually well supported on a firm surface, and you want your knees higher than your hips. And for women, having your knees a little bit slightly out because of the vaginal cleft. And again, that helps to just make sure we're fully allowing our bladder to empty. Now, for those who ever experience something like bladder incomplete emptying, where they don't feel like everything comes out, and there can be a lot of reasons why, there's a great tip that's called a double void. And what that is essentially is after you finished voiding, you would stand up, you would shake your pelvis out, do a few pelvic tilts, whatever you want to do. Then you're going to sit back down on the toilet and try to have a second void. So you're not pushing that pee out, but sometimes some urine can just get stuck in there from an anatomical position. And that can just help get it out and also feel more reassured that, okay, I truly have emptied as much as I can. And that is okay. When we're talking about bladder habits, some other things that are probably everyone at some point in the time, and maybe growing up more so, is peeing just in case. I feel like that is such a common thing where, I'm going to go for a drive or whatever it is. Let me just go to the washroom. And I mean, there are only a few instances where you should go to the washroom, even if your bladder's not telling you. That would be 1, after having sex to make sure we avoid infections. 2, if you're going on like a 4-hour drive, because that's a long time. Typically, every bladder is going to be 2 to 4 hours. So if you know it's going to be a very long period of time, then that can make sense. And then going to pee before bedtime at night as well, or when you wake up in the morning. But typically, you'd want to go anyways because your bladder should be full. And actually with peeing overnight, that isn't normal until the age of 50 when our hormones are shifting. So if you find you're peeing overnight as well, that's indicating there's something off with your bladder as well. So peeing just in case, why is that bad? Why can't we just do that? So that way we're preventively preventing, leakage or something along those lines. And the reason is it's the communication signal between your brain and your bladder. So essentially you have different points in time in your bladder where it's filling. And at each point, there's like 4 different points along the way. It'll send a signal in your bladder. It'll be like, okay, like my brain's like, okay, it's kind of getting there, but I can kind of hold it. And then I'll get to its max threshold where I'll send the signal to the brain. The brain will be like, okay, bladder is full. We need to go to the washroom. You walk to the washroom and you empty. Now, if you're going to the washroom before your bladder has reached that final threshold and your brain hasn't actually told your bladder you need to go, your brain starts to get confused. And there's this miscommunication between the brain and the bladder. And what happens over time is that threshold in your bladder actually decreases. So it's not that you have this small bladder and it's a genetic thing. That's actually like 1% of the population. It's a very rare thing. What's more likely happen is that you've retrained your bladder to need to go much more frequent. And every time you're going is only for a few seconds, maybe. And so it's really, really important to listen to our normal physiology. And if you're someone who's recognizing like, oh, this might be me, and I'm actually going more frequently, and I feel like I constantly need to go just in case because I don't know if I'll make it, and then there's no bathroom, and COVID, that's been a huge implication, I find too, where we couldn't use washrooms whenever we wanted to. You might need to work on bladder retraining, which is that behavioral piece that I was mentioning earlier. And so that's learning how to progress gradually and increasing that threshold again back to that normal physiology. And so there are specific bladder delay techniques to help build that threshold over time. Another piece that's so important that people think would be helpful, but it's actually counterintuitive, is your water intake. And people think, well, if I drink less water, I'm going to have to pee less often. But that's actually not true. What happens is the urine gets more concentrated in your pH levels, which makes it more acidic, which then irritates your bladder lining, that detrusor, and it spasms, making you need to go pee. So actually making sure you have lots of water and you're diluting it is really important. So those are some pieces, and making sure you never run to the washroom. So if you're someone who has a bit of that urgency or frequency, you tend to have sometimes triggers where it's like, oh, I just put the key in my door, I pulled up to the driveway, like I need to run to the washroom, or you've drinking coffee, and sometimes there's actual food and beverage triggers as well. We want to make sure we're kind of down regulating. That's the nervous system there, especially with the physical trigger. So you always want to walk calmly to the washroom, or if you know it's, whenever you put the key in your front door, maybe you're going to enter from a different part of your house, so because your brain is wired so much in one way. So those are kind of some of those other tips in that area.
Yeah, it's a great mind body practice. And it ties into, right? If I have a pelvic floor that's constantly tense, or I'm on edge and holding that energy in my body, like I say, yoga classes or with my clients, we don't know until we actively go chase down peace how it's going to feel and do some differences. So I actually have a question in the bladder realm, and I know we're going to take it further. But what came up while you were talking was, how does it work out when it comes to, like, I'll feel almost bloated when I have to pee really bad, and then like my yoga pants I don't like love how I look when I'm extended. And so I wonder if maybe there's that space that ladies are like, no, I want to feel like as pulled in tight as I can in my hips, and that's why I'm peeing all the time, because I don't want to like have a hole.
Mm.
Do you see that happen? Is that just me?
Um, that's interesting. I think I see more with the bowel piece than I would say the
Okay.
bladder, but it can for sure go both ways. I think a part of that is sometimes like we have this like phenomenon. I don't know if this is the same, where we feel like we kind of needs to always suck in and hold and brace in through that abdominal area. And that's actually really not a good thing. Our body is supposed to be able to kind of let it rest at its normal physiological state, because if we're constantly tensing and trying to contract that core, that actually is putting a lot of downward pressure on your pelvic floor and creating this tension that we were just talking about, right? Where everything is kind of stuck. And I talked about the pelvic floor, but I didn't talk about the inner core unit, which is kind of what we're getting at right now. So when you think of your inner core unit, these are your deep muscles of the pelvic floor. And well, the pelvic floor is one of the four. So your inner core unit, you have the pelvic floor that I talked about, which is at the bottom. In the front of the abdominal area, you have your transverse abdominis, which is this kind of muscle underneath your six-pack rectus abdominis muscle that wraps around the corset. You have your diaphragm on top, which is your breathing muscle, which is why you'll always hear breath work is so important in what we do in pelvic floor and yoga, because there is that connection. And then on the back, you have along your spine, your multifidus, which are these Christmas tree muscles that run up along the spine from your lumbar all the way to your cervical part. And so they all work together, and it's a pressure canister kind of situation, in the sense that when you're inhaling or when you're coughing, sneezing, laughing, any of those things, that diaphragm is moving down, and the pelvic floor then is withstanding that pressure. When we're thinking about breath work, there is a relationship, as I mentioned. Everything here is very synergistic. So when you inhale, your diaphragm lowers, your pelvic floor relaxes and lengthens. And as you exhale, your diaphragm comes back up and your pelvic floor contracts and engages. So it kind of creates this kind of nice kind of movement, which is often, again, counterintuitive to when we're first working with a pelvic physio and learning how to get that breath work. And I like to call this your core breath, because you're utilizing all your inner core muscles. It's not just Kegels per se, and Kegels is not the answer for everyone. But going back, that it's a canister, right? And it's based off of pressure. So if we're constantly bracing and kind of sucking everything in, well, that's creating a lot of pressure in through the other parts. So if you think of like a toothpaste kind of tube, and you squish the middle of the toothpaste, well, what's going to happen? The toothpaste is going to go up from the top or the bottom. And that's also what's happening in that inner canister unit, right? So I may have segued a little bit from your question, but it just recognizes that other piece of it's okay for it to kind of let it be out a little bit more. But if you find that, it has been, in fact, about, 2 hours since your last point, maybe you do need to go to the washroom, and it's also building a connection of knowing when you need to go, because there are some clients that only go once or twice a day, and that's also not okay. So it's kind of finding that balance, right? That middle ground, and building that connection to your body, that do you truly need to go, or is there another reason? And if there is another reason, well, why is that the case?
Yeah. And to connect the pressurization to digestion and then like bowel movements, I see that a lot too in like weight loss people that I work with. And it's dry brushing, which is just like that stimulation and like body love when it comes to like cellulite in your skin, but then abdominal massage, because I think we get so unattached and maybe in a place of self-judgment around what we're looking like, what we see in the mirror, but it's like, it's an organ. Like we have, yes, we have more adipose tissue around our organs right now, and we're working on getting that to a better place so you can have more health, be in more efficient kind of patterns of digestion and how your pancreas works, all that. But when we think about it now and add pressure to it, if you're not realizing that you're tensing your pelvic floor or you're holding some of those emotional pieces of the puzzle, right? Your digestion can't move as long. That 16 to 24-hour window that we're really looking for, if it's 5 days and you're tense the whole time, right? We're missing some of that rhythmic expression that you're talking about. I also want to double down on the squatty potty. We've had one for like 3 years. I do think it helps both my husband and myself. It's something to get used to, I will say that. I also spent like 3 months in Southeast Asia where there's only squatty potties, and thankfully I have the flexibility that makes that feel really good. So wherever you're listening from, I know that squatting position and the way that you're tilting your pelvis matters. But talk to us a little bit about evacuation, because I think, full evacuation is something, and this is just a guess, this is not a statistic, but I bet people aren't fully evacuating like they think they are. And it can leave you more uncomfortable. It is a big telltale sign about how your stress is going. So kind of give us a little piece of that. And then I want to share your tip sheet with everybody, because I know we could keep talking for hours, but
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So we'll talk a little about bowels, and I'll start with the squatty potty, because a lot of people have heard of it, but they're like, but I don't get it. Like, why is it? I'm going to talk physiologically, like what anatomically, what is happening and why is it beneficial? And maybe it's the depth, like maybe the squatty potty is too much. So you might need to go to the dollar store and just grab a different stool. And like, some people just put their garbage can sideways when they're traveling, and that works. Like you can kind of make shift. I did it when I was just in New York last weekend, but the importance of why that's the case. And it kind of speaks to kind of that fully emptying that you were just asking about. So in your descending colon, you have a muscle at the back of the pelvic floor that's called your puborectalis muscle. And that's the muscle that wraps around that sphincter of the anus. And that muscle fully relaxes when you are in a squatting position. So that means when your knees are higher than your hips. The other thing is your colon. So your descending colon naturally rests in about kind of like a 120-ish, kind of maybe a little more angle. But when you have that squatted position, it actually becomes more closer to a 180 degree. So then the poop can actually slide out. There's less of that kink. So physiologically, it helps to relax the muscle, and it actually changes the position of that descending colon. So that's why having that somewhat of a squatted position back to eons ago, which is what they did back in the day, they were on the right trajectory and they understood that. And so that's why it's so important. The other part is your breath again. And I always go back to breath, and you'll hear it all the time because it is so powerful in what you're doing in bowel movements. And oftentimes when we're having a hard time with the bowel movement, we do what's called a Valsalva maneuver, which is when you close your glottis, you close your mouth, and you do the type of activity, right? And that can be helpful for heavy lifting, although for women, again, that kind of has a caveat, but we won't go there. That's a whole other conversation. But in that moment, you're increasing this pressure in that regulating system that I was just talking about. And what happens is you're not actually relaxing your pelvic floor muscles. So similarly, when we were talking about bladder habits, with our bowels, they need to be fully relaxed when you're having a bowel movement. And what tends to happen, whether it's from stress, whether it's from pain, whether it's from habitual pattern, is we actually contract and clench those muscles down there. Or women who are having their first poop after having a baby and are like terrified from the episiotomy or stitches that they have, right? And it's really important to learn how to relax those muscles. And we do that with your breath. So like I said, when you inhale is when you're lengthening and relaxing that pelvic floor. So whether that's you doing shh or moo or whatever sound you want to make, and just allowing this area to just let go of its tension and let it flow, it will actually make a huge difference, because then that helps the pelvic floor lengthen, relax, to not feel gripping on to where the colon is, and get things moving in the right direction. Another tip, you mentioned the massage and just connecting with that area and, giving it that love, because it is an organ. also an I love you massage helps to kind of actually physically get things going in the right direction. So, and I've heard some people like, oh, I've heard of I love you massage, I've tried it, doesn't work. It's important to do it in kind of a bowel routine. So this is a routine I give all my clients, and I'll give it as a thing for the clients, everyone here listening, to try it out if that's something that they want to work on. So we know that there's something called a gastrocolic reflex, which is typically 15 to 20 minutes after meals when you're most likely going to have a bowel movement. As adults, you tend to have it more in the morning. Children tend to be more after supper, but again, everyone's different with their bowel routines. And so once a day, based on generally more when you feel that way, after that 15-20 minute mark, and maybe even a warm beverage, because that kind of helps stimulate the gastrocolic reflex, you would do the I love you massage. And I can put a YouTube link so those on my chip sheet so those people can check that out. And you can do with castor oil and have it topically over the abdomen, which is also helpful. You're also then going to do 10 squats, physical squats, where you go a stand up and then go into a squat, which again, if you can with your physical abilities, of course, because that actually helps mechanically to get things moving in the right direction. And then you're going to go on the toilet. You never want to spend more than 5 minutes on a toilet, because if that's the case, you then start to associate toilet with just sitting and then having your phone, and that opens up a whole can of worms. So you're just there. You're going to kind of use your nice breath techniques, have some sort of relaxed position in that kind of squat position. You could even try some alternate nostril breathing and see if you have a bowel movement. If you find after a few minutes nothing's happening, you want to leave and come back another time in a non-judgmental way, but know that you kind of gave it a go. And kind of having that bowel routine regularly can make a difference. But of course, there's so much more to that, from a diet perspective, from your fluid perspective, from a nervous system perspective, and gut health. And so you want to do it in collaboration with that and movement. But those are some physical strategies that can actually make a big difference that you can really start practicing later today. And so I want to give that to those who are listening, because it can be helpful.
Yes, thank you so much, Lea, for spending some extra time with us today. I appreciate you tuning in from Canada and dealing with time change and all the things. I know you're a busy gal up there in Ontario. And so, I hope you all follow Lea Physio. I hope, you take advantage of this tip sheet, hop into that YouTube and just learn more, because these resources are here for you. And I think it's a powerful place to be when women come together and know their specialty and have that collaboration, and like Leah's my pelvic floor gal, and I want that to like be a part of your life too, because there's things in life that we all need more of that information. And if there's any part of a health journey that I wish I knew in year one, or it's been like 10-15 years now, probably for both of us, is that it is always evolving, and and you're always learning new things, and your pelvic floor is not going to ever be a perfectly done practice, and the breath work changes, and then the intention around it changes. And that's why I really believe intimacy creates consistency. So please go check out Leah's tip sheet below, get registered, get signed up, follow her, and we're just so happy that you're here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always so passionate and happy to chat with all things pee, poo, and sex. And for those listening who, this raises so many questions and things and brings that curiosity, which I hope it does to those listening, feel free to send me a DM or email me. And I'm happy to kind of give some more guidance and things you can work on within your pelvic health journey.